Good afternoon. My name is Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. We are a 33-year-old free market think tank based in Dallas. And I'd like to welcome you all today to our Zoom policy discussion about the Electoral College and the National Popular Vote Initiative. We appreciate you all being here with us. We miss seeing you in person. We miss being able to do in-person events, but at least we have Zoom. And of course, the great thing about Zoom is it allows us to reach to a national and even international audience rather than just a regional office here in Dallas. So we're delighted to have you all with us. And we're grateful for the technology that has allowed us to keep doing our job of informing people about important critical policy issues, even despite an unprecedented pandemic. Let me also thank those of you who are with us who made an additional donation to help to sponsor this event. We very much appreciate those who voluntarily donate to help us support our work. Pandemics are not great times to raise money. You can't do meetings with people. You can't do in-person meetings and things like that. So the pandemic's been tough on all of us, but it's also been tough on nonprofits. So we really do very much appreciate those of you who are supporters and who have made donations to help us make this happen. If you enjoy this program so much that you just cannot wait to make a donation to IPI, we would welcome it. And I would suggest that you contact Addie Crimmins here at IPI, and she would be delighted to help you arrange your donation. Today's event is a webinar, not a meeting. If you've been doing Zoom meetings, you're used to seeing all those little squares with all the pictures in it. That's not how we're doing this one today. It's a webinar. So only the panelists are on video. Everyone else is simply listening into the audio. I suggest you, up in the upper right-hand corner, click on the speaker view. That will put whoever is actively speaking in the biggest window, and that's probably a better way to consume our content today. And as we mentioned a few minutes ago, you have two ways of asking a question. You can click on the Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can type in a question, or you can click on the participants menu and you can click on raise your hand, and we will call upon you and give you an opportunity to ask your question or make your comment live on audio by doing it that way. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. And that's enough preliminaries. Let's get on with our program. The Electoral College is an important structural component of our constitutional system of limited government, and the fact that we are a union of states, and those states having a diverse number of interests and diverse priorities. But the Electoral College today is under attack by progressives who seek to undo a constitutional republic and replace it with just raw majority rule everywhere. And there are also, strangely, some Republicans who you would think would know better who have signed on to this effort as well. And the effort we're talking about is something called the National Popular Vote Initiative. The National Popular Vote Initiative is a means of undermining the Electoral College by forcing states' electors to vote for whoever won the popular vote, regardless of what happened in that state, or at least that's my understanding of it. But today we have an expert with us who has a complete and total understanding of it, and he's going to be our special guest, and he's going to be our program today. Trent England is the founder and executive director of an organization called Save Our States. And Trent, my impression is that you guys are focused like a laser on this one specific topic. Trent has previously served as executive vice president for both the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs and also the Freedom Foundation, and as a legal policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. Trent was a fellow at the Claremont Institute in 2008. He's a producer of a feature-length documentary, Safeguard, an Electoral College Story, the author of Why We Must Defend the Electoral College, and a contributor to the Heritage Guide to the Constitution. Trent has a degree in law from George Mason University School of Law and a BA in government from Claremont McKenna College. And as I said, his organization is called Save Our States. Their website is saveourstates.org. And Trent is the perfect guest for us to have with us today to give us a historical background on the Electoral College. We entitled this event, Breaking the Founders' Bargain. The Electoral College was one of the key elements that allowed us to form a constitutional union. And so it's not a small thing to try to break that. So Trent, we're very much looking forward to hearing from you today. Give us sort of an understanding of the Electoral College, why we have it, why it's important, and then explain to us the threat of the National Popular Vote Initiative. And thanks again for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Tom. And thanks to everyone who is Zooming in with us today or joining us on Facebook. This is a topic that is so important, even though oftentimes it gets missed. You know, we just had a presidential election. Sorry about that if I disappeared there for a minute. We just had a presidential election, and that gets people sort of tuned into the Electoral College and these issues. But the rest of the time, it goes unnoticed. And even in many presidential elections, people don't spend very much time thinking about the Electoral College. But I'm going to argue here today, after we talk a little bit about the history of the Electoral College, and before we talk about this national popular vote threat, that this really is fundamental to our politics. It shapes the way our national politics work, and that does flow down into the rest of our state and local political organizing and coalition building. And I submit to you, and hopefully you'll agree with me when we're through here, that the Electoral College works even better than the American founders thought it would. Which is maybe a bold statement, since both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists thought the Electoral College was a pretty good system. But let's talk about how they got there. How do we wind up with this Electoral College system? The rough draft of the Constitution, which is called the Virginia Plan, called for a parliamentary system. That was the default when the delegates met at the Constitutional Convention for Congress to elect the president. That was an idea that, of course, was already, parliamentary systems was already something that existed at that time. And if you were forming a republic, that was kind of a logical way to choose your executive. But as the delegates began to discuss it in late May and into June of 1787, they realized that nobody really liked that system. And nobody really wanted that system because they wanted the separation of powers. They wanted three distinct branches of government, and they particularly wanted an executive who could be independent of the legislature for a variety of reasons that we don't have time to really go into here today. But one of their concerns was that they may still have to defend themselves from European powers, and they wanted an effective executive. Really, the founders, sometimes I think we confuse what the founders wanted. They wanted limited government, but within the spheres where it was proper for the federal government to operate, they wanted that government to be effective and even powerful within those very limited spheres. And they wanted that for the executive branch. And so tying the executive to Congress was a non-starter. But then you have a real problem, right? Because what do you do? They talked about having state governors or state legislatures elect the president. They ran into similar kinds of problems of tethering the executive to some group of existing politicians. They talked about even having members of Congress draw lots, and then sort of creating by random chance a select committee of Congress, and then locking them in a room and forcing them to choose the president, so that you couldn't have any politics or corruption pollute that process. But that was so out of the box that was kind of a non-starter as well. And so they talked about a popular election, just have a national popular vote for president. That is something that the American founders considered and rejected. And they rejected it for a couple of different reasons. But primarily, they're concerned that large population centers would control the executive branch and would really have undue influence over the federal government and leave a lot of other places, particularly the small states, leave them out where they would feel like we never have a shot at having an effect on a presidential election, right? And obviously in our presidential politics today, some places are said to matter more than other places in a particular election, but those things change over time. And this is important. Madison recognized this explicitly. You can't have parts of the country who feel permanently disenfranchised by the fundamental rules of your electoral system, right? So Madison says, look, we've talked about a parliamentary system. We've considered a popular vote. Madison says, in this sort of pivotal speech in late July at the convention, Madison says, look, I like the idea of a popular election, right? It's simple. It has sort of obvious appeal. Madison says we can't do that because the small states basically would be left out and the big states would have too much power. So let's figure out some other kind of a system that is that's democratic, right? That rests with the people, but that uses the states. And eventually, over the next month or 6 weeks at the convention, 5 weeks at the convention, this turns into the Electoral College, almost as we know it today. And at the very end of the process, Madison, as a part of a committee of trying to tie up the final things that hadn't been solved yet, the Electoral College being the biggest one, Madison basically puts pen to paper and comes up with the Electoral College. And as the Constitution is sent out to the states to be ratified, it's remarkable that this is actually one of the least controversial parts of the Constitution, especially considering where we are today. Alexander Hamilton is able to say in the Federalist Papers that, if it be not perfect, it is at least excellent. Which was, sort of, and he says that in a sort of a summary section on the or a couple of paragraphs on the Electoral College, where he points out that, even the opponents of the Constitution found it a suitable mechanism because it respected the states. So what is the Electoral College? What is this thing that Madison came up with? Of course, the Electoral College is based on the math of Congress. Every state has the same number of electoral votes as it has votes in the House and the Senate. And electors are real people. The people who cast those votes are real individual people. We sort of discovered this a lot of people discovered this in 2016 when there was some lobbying on presidential electors and little bits of chicanery here and there trying to get electors to change their votes. Electors are real people. And the operative part of the Constitution in Article 2 in the second paragraph says, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. And so you see right there why the Anti-Federalists would look at this and say, this is a pretty good system, right? The Anti-Federalists wanted power in the states. This puts power in the states, power in state legislatures to determine how to choose their state's electors. The founders said, look, we don't have to figure out how best to represent each state. States have legislatures. They can figure out how best to represent their own states in the presidential election process. And so state legislatures are given this power. They choose the number of electors equal to the number of members of Congress, House and Senate that they have in their state. And then federal law establishes the calendar for this. So when election day is, when the electors actually meet and cast their votes, when those votes are open in Congress, because the votes are sent to Congress, they're counted there. And this is all in federal law. So you have a system that starts with the Constitution, flows through the states, Congress makes some additional laws. I mean, this is lots of federalism, lots of checks and balances. Critics would say lots of moving parts, lots of potential for confusion or corruption, I suppose. But the founders looked at this and said, look, this actually, this by pushing the power out and pushing the power down, this actually reduces the potential for corruption and hopefully increases the possibility that we get highly qualified people to serve as president, right? That's what they wanted. They did think that the system might often deadlock and throw the presidential election to the House of Representatives, because if no candidate gets a majority in the Electoral College, the election goes to the House of Representatives and they choose between the top candidates. That only happened twice, in 1800 and in 1824. Otherwise, what we call today political parties, which the founders would have maybe not thought of. When the founders talked about political parties, they tended to think of much more narrow factions. Our political parties today, partly because of the Electoral College, have developed into these broad coalitions that are seeking to get 50% plus 1%, of the vote, right, rather than some narrow interest groups that are forming coalitions. And because of all this, right, the Electoral College has had some profound effects on our politics over time. And these are really important to talk about, because these are the things, when people attack the Electoral College, they threaten to do away with not just this constitutional compromise, but with all of these effects, some of which the founders didn't even anticipate. But where we now can look back and see this system works, as I said at the beginning, even better than the founders thought. So, of course, the Electoral College does do what James Madison wanted it to do. It does keep the biggest states and the biggest cities from controlling the executive, right? That's pretty obvious, and has become maybe even more obvious in the last 20 years. But what else has the Electoral College done throughout American history? Where can we see its effects? And one thing that folks who oppose the Electoral College often say is, well, that it was created to support slavery, and it supported slavery, and it supported Jim Crow, and it's tainted with racism, and they'll offer that as a reason why we should get rid of it. Well, just having gone through the history of how we got the Electoral College ought to settle this whole contention that it was about slavery, right? If the initial plan was a parliamentary system, and if the reason why a direct election was rejected was because of small states, there were small states in the North, there were very small states in the South as well, right? It's very clear that slavery is not the reason why we have the Electoral College, right? The issue of slavery was ever present at the Constitutional Convention. It was one of the divisive and was becoming a sectional issue in the country at that time, although slavery was unfortunately legal in every state at the time the Constitution was written. So it wasn't as sectional as it would become a few decades later, or even just a few years later. But you can see slavery was not the reason why we have an Electoral College. That's just false. But what about this contention that it helped the slave states? That maybe even if they didn't say it, or even if it wasn't a primary motivation, that the Electoral College was created to prop up the slave states. Well, when you look at what actually happened in elections between the American founding and the Civil War, you find that the benefit for states that in the South, the states we think of as the slave states, was about 1%. It never switched an election to favor the South. And the one election where it was decisive that we had an Electoral College rather than a popular vote system is the election where John Quincy Adams is chosen by the House of Representatives after an Electoral College deadlock in 1824. John Quincy Adams was the most anti-slavery president we had before Abraham Lincoln. So the argument that the Electoral College somehow benefited slave states is preposterous. I mean, it's completely untrue. And history, the history of how the Electoral College worked before the Civil War shows that. And what about this contention that the Electoral College somehow has racist effects? It had racist effects in American history, or has racist effects today. These things are also easy to show as false. After the Civil War, the Electoral College forced the Democratic Party, which could win the most popular votes in the South by the mid-1870s. This happens in 1876, happens again in 1888. But the Electoral College forces political parties and candidates to have a nationwide coalition. And so the Democrats, after the Civil War, were forced to moderate, right? They didn't need to win 84% in South Carolina, which they were doing in those couple of decades, but they needed to get over 50%, or at least a plurality in New York, right? Or maybe in Ohio or Illinois or New Jersey. They had to moderate so that they could reach out, so that they could rebuild a national coalition, only because of the Electoral College. One of the things that they did, interestingly enough, is they reached out to new immigrants who were being ignored by Republicans who were so dominant in the northern states. A lot of Irish Catholic immigrants in particular. That's fairly odd for a party that also included the Ku Klux Klan, right? To be reaching out to Irish Catholic immigrants. I mean, this is surprising. This is the effect of the Electoral College. This is why the Democrats didn't nominate Elizabeth Warren, right? They nominated Joe Biden because Joe Biden is far more appealing, and yes, he's more moderate than an Elizabeth Warren or a Bernie Sanders, right? They did that partly out of an Electoral College. I would say primarily out of an Electoral College calculation, moderating so that you can build a broader coalition, so that you have a better chance at winning presidential elections. And the upshot of my little story about the 1870s and 1880s is you go a few generations down, further in American history, and you find that the descendant of one of those Irish Catholic immigrants who was brought into the Democratic Party coalition back in the 19th century becomes one of the most staunch and vocal defenders of the Electoral College in the middle of the 20th century. That was then Senator John Kennedy, the junior senator from Massachusetts, back in the 1950s, when some Southern Democrats were trying to push a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College. It was JFK who stood up and said, we shouldn't do this, right? The Electoral College forces or creates an incentive for better coalition building and more national unity. And he pointed out that actually one of the Democrats behind the push to abolish the Electoral College back then had actually gone on record saying, if we could just get rid of the Electoral College, we wouldn't have to listen to Blacks and to Jewish people in Democratic Party politics, right? I mean, they were open about it. They understood the Electoral College was forcing them, even in the 1950s, to be more moderate and to be more racially inclusive. This is why when you go up to the 1960s and 70s, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in the mid 60s, a lot of civil rights groups were big defenders of the Electoral College, including the NAACP, including the Urban League. Vernon Jordan, who would later become a prominent attorney for Bill Clinton, was leading the Urban League in the 1970s and was a major defender of the Electoral College because it gave minority groups, and it still does, a seat at the table because they can affect the power in particular states, right? Republicans are very attentive to Hispanic voters, not just in Florida, but in Texas, right? And there's been a lot of celebrating that Republicans gained so much vote share down in the Rio Grande Valley. Really an amazing result, right? But that effect is going to help keep Texas a red state, right? Now, if you just had a national popular vote, you might dismiss a lot of those minority interests. There might be easier ways to win votes closer to your party's base. But the Electoral College forces parties to reach out farther. And it did that in the 19th century, in the 20th century, it still does that today. But some people don't like that. After 2000, when Al Gore lost, a trio of law professors on the left decided that they were going to come up with a new strategy to get rid of the Electoral College that didn't require amending the Constitution, because amending the Constitution is very hard, thankfully, right? And so they came up with, a lot of people say, well, it's just impossible. The Electoral College is in the Constitution. Well, these guys, you got to give them a lot of credit. They're very smart law professors. I disagree with them completely, but they came up with this plan. What if you got state legislatures? Remember, state legislatures have some power here. What if you got state legislatures to just ignore how their own people vote and instead choose their state's presidential electors on the basis of the national popular vote, right? So if this had been the law in Texas in 2016, if a law like this was in effect, then Texas's election for presidential electors would have been certified for Hillary Clinton, right? For the Democrats. The Democrat slate of presidential electors would have been chosen as Texas's presidential electors. And of course, they would have voted for Hillary Clinton, right? If you had enough states that had that law, this national popular vote law, in effect in 2016, assuming the campaigns were run the same way, then Hillary Clinton would have won because she would have got the electoral votes out of the states that had a law like that. Now, a lot of people say, well, come on, what state would give away its power in presidential elections? I mean, this is, in a way, an idea so dumb that James Madison just never worried about it, right? I mean, that the American founders couldn't conceive of state politicians giving away their people's power. But, in the 21st century, in an era where, as Tom suggested, right, some people view democracy not as an important mechanism in Republican government, but as a moral standard for government, right? Which is to cut to the chase, profoundly dangerous, right? If you think that democracy is your moral standard, you have a real problem, especially if you're the proverbial lamb in the two wolves and a lamb deciding on what's for dinner, right? Not always a great system, but they launched this national popular vote campaign in 2006 with a tremendous amount of money behind it, tens of millions of dollars. mostly coming from a handful of billionaires in the San Francisco area. One of them, who leads the effort up, invented the algorithm behind the scratch-off lottery ticket back in the 1970s. So, the guy wins on every scratch ticket. He's got some scratch to invest in throwing out the Electoral College. And they launched this effort. They began winning states, particularly some of the big states, the big blue states, California, Illinois, eventually New York, also just hardcore progressive states like Hawaii, Washington, Oregon, Maryland, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont. I think I've listed off almost all the states. And then after 2016, when 2016 obviously made this a hot topic among activists on the progressive left. 2018, the Democrats won power in more state legislatures, and they picked up New Hampshire. That was actually the year they picked up Oregon. They almost won in Nevada, but the governor there vetoed it. They almost won in Maine, but a few legislators flipped their votes back, kept that state out of the popular vote compact. Now, at this point, you might be saying, well, wait a second, I haven't heard about any states casting their votes this way. Now, that's true. One of the really clever things that the folks who came up with the national popular vote scheme did, they wrote it as an interstate compact, an agreement among the states, so that it takes effect all at the same time. So all of these states have passed it. 15 states have passed the national popular vote law. They control 196 electoral votes, but the law only takes effect if it's passed by enough states that they control 270 electoral votes. That's the magic majority, right? You control 270 electoral votes, you control who becomes president of the United States. So the law, even though it's on the books in a lot of states, has not taken effect. The concern at this point, obviously, is they are on track. It potentially could take effect before the 2024 election, right? I mean, they have been winning states. We fought them to a draw kind of in the period from like 2011 to 2016. But this has become a major issue for the left, and they have been lobbying very hard, especially on Republican legislatures, to try to get not just blue states, but some purple and red states to pass this law. They argue that it's more fair. They argue that people would feel better about democracy. Obviously, there's no question. If you get rid of the Electoral College, it is more democratic. So the Electoral College is a democratic system too. It's a two-step democratic system. But they argue that we'll achieve this sort of political panacea. The reality, of course, is that not only do you lose all of the checks and balances and benefits associated with the Electoral College, but this National Popular Vote Compact is really uniquely dangerous, because to abolish the Electoral College in effect, sort of leave it as this zombie mechanism in the Constitution, obviously creates a lot of potential for states to try to game the system. California is so big that it could potentially toggle the compact on or off, depending on whether they believe it's in their interests or not. And nobody would really know how it's going to work as you go into an election like that, where you would have this unstable set of rules, where states actually have to rely on other states' election results in order to determine who won in their own state. That's something that's never been done before. And you could just look at this election right now. I mean, do public officials in Texas or in Oklahoma, where I am, trust what's going on in Philadelphia or in Detroit or in Atlanta, right? Or if the shoe was on the other foot, would election officials in Sacramento trust the way elections are being run in Texas, right? But National Popular Vote relies on all of this just sort of working seamlessly with no contention and no disputes. The compact itself actually says nothing about disputes. It's literally just silent. Nothing about how you would have a nationwide recount, how you would referee disputes among the states, which in effect means that it would throw everything to a collection of state and federal judges, which I don't think I have to explain why that's a bad idea. But no, this is a major campaign out there on the progressive left that is has been going on now for almost 15 years. I created Save Our States in 2009 to track it and to push back against it. And we've had some success, but we're really trying to raise the alarm among Americans, on the right, in the middle, and even those on the left who understand the importance. And there are folks on the political left who understand the importance of these checks and balances and of putting the power in our states. Um, I'll wrap up there, except I do want to say something. Tom had asked me to say something about why there are some Republicans who support this. So I'll wrap up with that, and then we'll get to questions. I mean, the sales pitch to Republicans is oftentimes based on this idea. I almost called it a myth, but I'll be really polite and just call it this idea that there are all these Republican voters in states like California and New York who don't come out and vote because they know their state is going to go blue. And that if you had a national popular vote system, then all of a sudden, all of these Republican voters would emerge from the big blue states. The problem with that is we have blue states, we have red states. We have a few big blue states. We have a lot of smaller red states, right? If Republicans aren't showing up to vote in California, the same logic would suggest that Democrats aren't showing up to vote in Oklahoma, right? Or in Kansas, or, on and on. I doubt that has as big of an effect as people think it is. I also think, having been a Republican who actually grew up on the West Coast, I grew up in Washington State. I went to school in California. I tend to believe that voters on the right maybe maybe are more likely to vote out of a sense of civic duty than just the idea that I'm going to vote because I'm going to be on the winning team, or I'm going to be the one decisive vote in this election. You can't really quantify that, but that's my that's my experience. So I think that there is this sort of mythical idea out there about the hidden Republican voter who's going to emerge. I just think it's not true. I think it's sort of easy to look at the maps of the states and understand why, to the extent that that is true, there are Democrat voters who would do the same thing. But the reality is, if you get rid of the Electoral College, you just change our politics. And I think all the people pushing this, there's sort of a failure of imagination, right? If you change the rules of the game, you get a different game, right? And the problem is, if you eliminate this two-step system that we've always had, you eliminate some of the incentives for building these broad nationwide coalitions in a way that make it a lot more likely that we'd see more spoiler candidates, spoiler parties, or splinter parties and spoiler candidates. People like Michael Bloomberg would not go seek the Democrat nomination, right? They would go directly into the general election with their billions of dollars. Some people think that's a good thing. I think on balance, it's a bad thing to have less stable, more fractious politics. And that's really fundamentally for me why I think the Electoral College is so important. I think it's good to keep power in the states, but I think we need all of the incentives toward moderation and national unity we can get, especially at a time like this in our nation's history. So thank you so much, Tom. Really glad to be here. Thanks to all of you watching, and I look forward to taking some of your questions.
Trent, that was terrific. I mean, I could not have imagined a better presentation than that. So I really appreciate it. I'm going to ask you a couple questions. I'm sure Dr. Matthews will have questions. But to our attendees, this is the time to get your questions in. So either raise your hand on the participants menu or type in your question under the Q&A, and we will get to those. Trent, first of all, I want to say your point about how the Electoral College forces a presidential candidate to seek a broader coalition is one that had never occurred to me. So thank you for that. That's really interesting. I tend to focus more on the idea that the founder's design was correct and that any departure from it is a mistake. But that sort of practical consideration had never occurred to me. Let me ask you a question. Doesn't the Constitution require Congress to validate any kind of interstate compact? We've run into interstate compacts before, and the shoals they've always washed up on is this idea that Congress has to approve it before it can take effect. So isn't that also true of the national popular vote?
Yeah, I mean, Article 1, Section 10 says that interstate compacts require the consent of Congress. This is one of these issues where people who read the Constitution know what the answer is. The constitutional text is very clear. People who read decisions of the Supreme Court aren't so sure, because the Supreme Court has never struck down an interstate compact for failing to get congressional consent, and in some cases has even said, well, if Congress could strike down the compact, but if Congress says nothing, it's then we'll read that as congressional consent, which is preposterous.
Almost
But
like a pocket, almost like a pocket veto kind of a thing, right?
yeah, I mean,
Huh.
it's so this is where there's been an interesting evolution in the rhetoric from the national popular vote side. They started out saying that they didn't need congressional consent, and they argued that based on Supreme Court decisions, and also based on the idea that the power delegated to state legislatures in Article 2 is absolute, which I think that's silly, because the power delegated to state legislatures uh, it doesn't include making an interstate compact, right? So uh, I think you're right. I think it should require the consent of Congress. Even some national popular vote advocates have started to acknowledge that and just say, well, once we get enough states to adopt it, then we'll go to Congress and ask them to approve it. I mean, the compact claims to take effect instantaneously upon passing the 270 vote threshold. So, their post hoc rationalization, uh, I don't know if it would stand up in court, even if they got congressional consent. But I am concerned that the case law is just terrible on this.
Okay, so my second question is this. I'm a big believer that if you haven't read the Federalist Papers, you haven't done your due diligence as a U.S. citizen, and I think everybody needs to do that. And one thing, when you read the Federalist Papers, one thing you come away with is that the founders had a very strong concern that factions, and essentially what they mean is a majority at any given time, right? That a popular majority should never be able to just run over a minority. And so much of our government design seems to be to prevent majority rule, not to facilitate majority rule, right? The Senate, in our original design, was not an elected position. It was not a majority rule thing. So there are elements in our system. There are elements of democracy in our system, but our system was never designed to be democratic from top to bottom. And the purpose of that, as I read it, is to prevent majorities from being able to just routinely run over minorities. And it seems to me that the Electoral College is one expression of that. That the population centers, in our colonial days, the population centers would have been Boston and Philadelphia, right? That they can't run over Rhode Island and South Carolina, right? Well, it strikes me that that's still absolutely true today. So I don't understand why a state like Nevada would sign on to the National Popular Vote Initiative, because if it ever were to become law, no one would ever pay attention to Nevada again. There would be absolutely no reason for any presidential campaign to pay attention to Nevada. So is it just raw politics that a state like Nevada signs on to something like that?
I mean, particularly in the case of Nevada, I think you're right. I mean, it really was an act of raw politics. I mean, there were state legislators there who wanted to vote against it, but were put in a position where I think they felt like to vote to keep the Electoral College was a vote for Donald Trump. Basically, I mean, that became the politics, and thankfully the governor there, who is a Democrat, vetoed the bill, and he said exactly what you said. He said, look, we're not going to give away our voting power to Los Angeles.
Right.
I mean, Los Angeles is larger than the population-wise than the entire state of Nevada. I mean, Los Angeles population-wise is larger than all but just a handful of other states. LA County itself has 10 million people in it, and I think there are only 9 other states that have 10 million or more people, right? I mean, that's the population imbalance. Sometimes people don't realize how dramatic it is. But no, you're right. I mean, it's for states like Nevada, Vermont, Rhode Island to join this compact, Delaware. It's been an interesting transformation, because 10 years ago, I was engaged in this fight in almost all of those states, and we beat it. I mean, we beat the National Popular Vote Compact in all these places, um, and then they came back after 2017, basically, and and the kind of state legislators had, the kind of Democrat state legislators in these states had changed to become much more radically progressive left. And at the same time, they were in this kind of box where they felt like, voting for national popular vote was a way to be with the resistance and show their opposition to Donald Trump, whether they really liked it or not. And I think a lot of them voted for it with their fingers crossed, hoping that it never actually takes effect.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one last question, then I'll turn it over to Dr. Matthews. Why did you decide, just sort of at a personal level, why did you decide to devote yourself to this? What is it about this that's so compelling to you personally?
So when I was in college back in the 1990s, I had a professor named Michael Ullman, who was just a one of the most incredible people I've ever known. And he had been on the United States Senate Judiciary Committee staff back in the 1970s and had written the minority report against a proposed constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College. And he gave that report to us in class, and he talked about the issue. And it just struck me, as you were saying before, Tom, that this is a part of our constitutional system that most people don't understand, but it's right at the heart of this idea that we're not a democracy in the sense of being a majoritarian regime, right? We're a regime that believes in something higher than that, which ultimately is justice, right? We believe in justice or the good. And because we believe in that, we always have to see democracy as important, right? Because the people have to be able to maintain control of our government. But democracy is not the moral standard. It's not the purpose of government. And the Electoral College has, it embodies that idea, and also this idea that we are states and that it's a good thing that we have these political subdivisions. And I came to believe that it's really that there were three pillars of federalism in the original Constitution. One was the United States Senate, and that was really almost entirely eliminated by the 17th Amendment, right? The senators do not represent states as states anymore, other than just sort of, the fact that we have state boundaries, right? But they don't represent state governments or state interests. And the other was the second one was the limited powers of the federal government, right? Those enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8. And that was basically done away with by Congress and the president and the Supreme Court by the 1940s, right? And Wickard versus Filburn is what people usually look to in that regard, right? So you see the first pillar being toppled in 1913, the second pillar being toppled in 1942, and then and then we have the Electoral College. I mean, it's really the last thing in the Constitution that's still honored, that respects states as states and has the effect of preserving that important vestige of sovereignty, which is control over your electoral system. And I think if we lose the Electoral College, states will lose control over elections. And, at that point, states really are a lot more like subdivisions of the federal government rather than independent sovereignties.
Yeah, thanks. Dr. Matthews?
Thank you. And Trent, let me second Tom's notion. It was a very good presentation. So let me ask you three what I think will be quick questions. You had mentioned that if you change the Electoral College, you change the system. Has there been any changes to the Electoral College in the last 240 years or so, either from the state or from the federal government? Number two, you mentioned Madison went off and developed the Electoral College. Well, as you know, a lot of our people were, a lot of the founders were good students of political history. Was there anything that was a sort of a model that he pulled? He said, there's a system over here I pulled from elements of that. Do we know if that's the case? And thirdly, you mentioned that one of the reasons for the Electoral College is to try to minimize corruption. Do we have any instances of corruption that has occurred in the Electoral College over the years?
Great questions, Merrill. Thank you. So I'll start with the state changes, or with the changes to the Electoral College, state and federal. So the one big change which doesn't really bear on what we've talked about today, was the 12th Amendment, which, for people who've seen Hamilton, the musical, the election of 1800 and Aaron Burr almost winning, traumatized the American founders, not to mention the whole experience the 4 years before of Jefferson being Adams' vice president, right? The original idea was that the runner-up would become vice president. And so the 12th Amendment said, no, we're gonna vote separately for president and vice president. That gave rise to the ticket system, having a president and vice president run together. That really solidified. I mean, the party system emerges out of the ratification debates, Federalists and anti-Federalists, and then Federalists and Democratic Republicans. But the 12th Amendment really kind of locks that in, because then parties could run two people for the top spot very specifically. So that's the big federal change in 1804, right? So other than that, we haven't had any big changes to the Electoral College process constitutionally. States have made some changes over time, although it was pretty early on that most states went to the system that they use today, like Texas uses today and Oklahoma, which is winner take all, right? You get the most votes in a state, you get all that state's electoral votes. Maine and Nebraska split them up. Various states throughout American history have done that, split up their electors in some way. Some states actually used to have presidential elector districts, right? So Maine and Nebraska use their congressional districts, but you could, here in Oklahoma, where we have 7 presidential electors, we could draw 7 districts and elect them district by district. But the Democrats really recognized early on that your party has more power if your state casts all of its votes, by winner take all, or the unit rule. And so gradually, almost every state adopted that. Some legislatures used to directly appoint presidential electors, but that was basically, that was popular when George Washington was going to win, right? Everybody knew it. That quickly went out of style as you have parties emerge, and the idea that look, people can vote for their elected official or their state officials. So those are the changes. As far as historical examples, I have never found anything that's a really concrete example for the Electoral College. I think they certainly looked at a lot of examples of what not to do, right? And those would be the more direct democracies. The founders were certainly very wary of more direct democratic systems. And in talking about the Electoral College, those kind of examples would come up. That we don't want to have a system that basically is just mob rule. But as far as I think there may have been a reference to the College of Cardinals in the debates. They certainly talked in other contexts about the Swiss cantons and the kind of federalism that they had in Switzerland. But no, they're not really a concrete historical example that I'm familiar of. The flip side, our system has become a historical example that in the 20th century, when West Germany was writing up its constitution and when India created its constitution, they both have electoral colleges. Yeah, they're not exactly the same as ours, but India in particular is explicitly based on our electoral college, even though it works a little bit differently. India needed a system that would fight against the entropy of regionalism, and so that's what they have. As far as corruption, I mean, the most corrupt election in American history was probably 1876. Yeah. And certainly, I mean, the Electoral College isolated all of that. And then the election goes to the House of Representatives, not in a contingency election, but in terms of the House deciding which slates of electors to accept, because Florida and Louisiana and one other state sent 2 slates of electors. The Democrats said we won, and the Republicans said we won, and Congress had to sort this out. There was corruption all through the process, except really in the electors casting their votes. It's the interesting thing. I mean, people talk about faithless electors. I don't think there's a single example of a presidential elector actually being corrupt. Now, they may have cast their vote in some way that made people mad, or that they weren't expected to, or even violated a state law. But as far as an elector being corrupt, I don't know of any examples of that.
Good. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Matthews, did you get all three of your questions answered?
I did.
Okay, we have a lot of questions. So I'm going to go to Carl first of all. Carl, go ahead, please. Your microphone is on.
Well, first of all, Mike Ullman was one of my closest lifelong friends, and I was very sad when he passed away last year. It was quite tragic and a great loss to the community. We are a republic, not a democracy, if you can keep it, said Franklin. It strikes me that there are three key issues. One you can resolve very quickly. Please send to Tom for transmission to the rest of us the states which have ratified this abomination. The second thought, which I'm curious about, is that if you look at the control of the state legislatures, actually 27 are controlled by Republicans, 20 are controlled by Democrats, and 3 are split, or they don't have a vote. Seems to me that somehow ought to play into this question of selection of the electors. And finally, what have you researched? What sort of legal challenges could be brought against this interstate compact and the idea that it could go into effect without congressional action, without the approval of both houses?
Thank you, Carl, for your question. Yeah, everyone who knew Michael Yolen was blessed to know him. To your questions, I will send we have a map of the states that shows where it has passed, and also where the compact has been passed through at least one legislative chamber at some earlier time, just to give folks an idea of the states that have been concerns in the past. You mentioned party control of legislative chambers. I mean, there's a practical element there where, you would hope that chambers controlled by Republicans, or states where there's mixed control, it would be a lot harder for a national popular vote to get through. That has been the experience so far, although we have seen a few Republican controlled chambers pass the bill, but it's never gone all the way through in a Republican state. And I could tell you all kinds of war stories about what we've had to do to stop it in some of these states, but I won't take the time to do that now. There is, state legislatures have a role to play in all of this. You see this even in the conversation right now, and you would hope that legislators would stand up for that. This has been kind of a part of my stump speech to state legislators for a decade. Is James Madison talked about them being a double security to the rights of the people. But just as we have a republic if we can keep it, right? State legislators have that role if they choose to live up to it. Too often we see that they don't. As to legal challenges to the compact, we've been working with some top litigation attorneys on several different potential legal challenges. You mentioned the compact clause issue. That's certainly something where Congress would have standing to challenge it. The big issue for us right now is nobody has standing until it takes effect. And that's been my conclusion all along. I do have a friend who's an attorney who tried to bring a suit against NPV, and he got booted out of court instantly, because there's just no standing to sue to challenge a law that's not yet in effect. But
that's because no one's been harmed yet, essentially, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. A judge will just say this may never take effect, right? Nobody's been harmed, and it may never take effect. So, to have a judge rule on it would, sort of violates the limits on judicial power. But if it took effect, you have the compact clause issue. That's an issue for members of Congress to raise. You also have the structural constitutional issue. That's something that probably a variety of plaintiffs could raise. Just, this has the effect of changing the constitutional structure. It violates the purpose of the Electoral College, though it doesn't clearly violate the letter of Article 2 or the 12th Amendment, but it clearly violates the structure that we have there. I mean, Justice Kagan decided two cases on faithless electors, wrote the court's opinion back in early July. And, I don't necessarily agree with the kind of reasoning that Justice Kagan uses, but she basically said, look, from the beginning of the Republic, we've always understood electors represent states. Therefore, states can pass laws that require electors to represent states. I mean, sort of taking Justice Kagan at her word, from the beginning of the Republic, we've understood that electors represent states. Those states are their own states. The idea that legislatures can give that power away, I think based on some dicta in Justice Kagan's opinion, you might find some votes against that. And finally, and maybe most persuasive in all of this, are arguments based on equal protection, because no state, think about Texas's counties, right? Texas has to have the same election laws and relatively similar practices across all of Texas's counties, or else that would violate equal protection. But if Texas was a party to national popular vote, and Texas had to take the vote totals from Massachusetts and from Oklahoma and basically pretend like those are all, they would be voters for the purpose of Texas electing Texas's own presidential electors, that would seem to violate equal protection, right? You would be claiming to have a national election under such disparate standards that it would violate equal protection under the 14th Amendment. There actually is really good case law on that. Of course, there's never been an effort to hold an election across state lines, so you're out of the box in that regard. But no, we are looking at legal challenges, and I want to win this in the political branches. I want to win this in state legislatures. I think that's the best way to do it. But if we get to the point where we've got to challenge it in court, we're ready for that also.
Okay, Trent, we have a number of questions and comments. Let's see how many of them we can get to in 15 minutes. I would invite people to go ahead and continue to submit questions if you have them, but we may not be able to get to all of them. Bob Clark, you mentioned this, but Bob Clark suggests that the arguments against the Electoral College sound equally similar to the arguments against the U.S. Senate, right? I mean, it tends to be the same people who object to the Electoral College also seem to object to the fact that the Senate is not proportionally representative as well.
Yeah, national popular vote lobbyists will say, "Oh no, absolutely not." But no, the logic is clear, and pointing that out in Maine in particular to state legislators there helped us to kill the NPV bill in Maine.
Very good. We have a couple of people who have asked the same question, which is, if a state passed the NPV when they were controlled by Democrats, if Republicans retake control, can't they rescind it in the state? I would assume the answer to that's yes.
Yes, they can. And if it had crossed 270 and then dropped back beneath 270, it would go out of effect.
Is part of your strategy as an organization trying to get it overturned in various states where that potential is there?
Yeah, I mean, there are political challenges to that, but we try to get as many repeal bills active in any state where we have champions who are willing to do that. And also we're working with legislators in other states to pass resolutions or even laws or potentially even constitutional amendments, state constitutional amendments that oppose national popular vote, because a state could put it into its constitution that only voters in our state can choose our state's electors. That would leave them open to congressional district or proportional or all kinds of different things that are legitimate exercises of the Article 2 power, but would exclude the potential for something like national popular vote. South Dakota earlier this year passed a resolution that I had written that ALEC has published to state legislatures, explaining the importance of the Electoral College and condemning national popular vote. So that's, we're working on all those strategies.
So ALEC has a model legislation or a model proposition that is in opposition to NPV?
Yes.
Good, very good. Robert Jacoby, our friend Robert Jacoby, says that he assumes that if the compact gets to 270, it could still be thrown out as unconstitutional. But that sort of depends on, that sort of throws it into the world of getting judges to agree with you, right?
Yeah, I never put my faith in federal judges, even though the federal judiciary is much more to my liking these days. No, that's true. And you also could have a state court judge or state Supreme Court throw it out in a particular state. There are a couple of states that actually do have constitutional provisions like what I mentioned a moment ago. They're not explicitly about the Electoral College, but like Virginia has a provision that basically says you have to be a resident of Virginia to vote in Virginia elections. Arguably, NPV violates that. So yeah, there are state legal challenges that can throw it out in an individual state, and then there are the federal constitutional challenges also.
Okay, Skip Kalb. Well, as you might imagine, let me say first, as you might imagine, we have a number of questions that are relevant to the immediate political situation, right?
Yeah.
Some of these states that are in dispute. And Skip Kalb wants to know, is it really true that a state legislature can choose to allocate their electoral votes in a different way than the popular vote? And if so, what would constitute a legitimate basis for a state legislature to make that decision? So this, I mean, this is, you know, it is directly related to the Electoral College, although it's not related to the MPV, but you can understand why people are interested in this topic at this time.
That's a great question. And I've been providing advice, and some of my colleagues have been providing advice to some state legislators on this. So the question is very well constructed because it anticipates the issues, right? State legislatures can appoint presidential electors, but if a state that's an exercise of their power to determine the manner of selecting them, right? So if a legislature has already exercised that power and said, we're going to hold an election, can they come back and change that after the fact? And I would say the answer is maybe, is no, but they could if they meet a certain threshold, which the question anticipates as well. So here's the thing: if you hold an election, we do see elections sometimes thrown out, and there's actually a particular election in Nevada that may be thrown out and go to another election that, you know, it was held on the general election day a couple of weeks ago, but the margin is very close, and the number of disputed votes or just, you know, flat wrongly counted votes is such that that it's greater than the margin. And so when judges look at that, they typically say, look, the only fair thing to do is to hold a revote. And that can be because of mistakes. It can be because of fraud. It can be because of a mix of those things. So what I've told state legislators, and I think this is the right answer, even though it's never been tested in court, is if a legislature determined that the election was flawed such that you really can't tell who won. So, you know, that would be, I mean, if it turns out that some states' voting machine software was flawed and you can't go back and you can't do a hand recount and determine what, you know, who the real victor was, then at that point, I think just going ahead and choosing electors based on that election actually probably violates the Constitution, probably violates that equal protection clause in the 14th Amendment. At that point, the legislature, I think, is free to step in. But I do think they would have to have a real factual finding, right? The legislature, to do this right, what I've recommended is, I mean, you create a select committee, it would be serious, you'd hear evidence, I mean, you'd go through a court-like process to make this determination. And then the way I would suggest, you would have the legislature vote on, these are our findings. And then from there, I think the legislature would, you know, you could try to hold a snap election. That's probably not possible, or they could directly appoint presidential electors. I mean, they certainly have that power, but I think there would have to be something that had the effect of nullifying the manner that they had already chosen being a popular vote.
Yeah, I mean, time is not on your side if you're trying to challenge something like that. You know, if you take Skip's question, it's worth drilling down on this, I think, because this is immediately relevant, right? If you take Skip's question and you try to like game it out, it's clear that in our system, the intention is that elections are purely political, right? They're not legislative and
Yeah,
they're not judicial, they're political, right? So,
that's exactly right.
so you take a state like Pennsylvania, and let's say the networks award Pennsylvania to Biden, but the legislature of Pennsylvania, for some reason, to decide to override that and, select electors for Trump. The people of Pennsylvania would have something to say about that at the next election, right? They could say, hey, we don't like what you did. We're going to throw you out of office. And in theory, the legislators in Pennsylvania are afraid of that happening. So the more you drill down on some of these things, the more astonished you are at the brilliance of our founders and our designers, because, if a legislator decided, you know what, I'm just going to, by hook or by crook, try to throw this election in a direction that is contrary to our state's voters, his political career would probably be over.
Well, that's right, and yeah, I actually spoke to a group on Monday night, and that was a part of what we talked about. Is we look to the courts to solve all of our disputes, but when you look at how this electoral college process works, it starts with state legislatures and it ends with Congress. And I not to go back and quibble about the 2000 election, but ultimately it should have been Congress that, I mean, the legislature in Florida was fully empowered, I think, in an election where, different recount scenarios have shown that you could get different winners in Florida. I mean, it was essentially a tied election, or an election that was so close that these weird disputes could sway it in either direction. I mean, the legislature could have appointed electors directly, and ultimately, I mean, Congress plays a role in establishing the rules by which they count electoral votes, and then in actually counting those votes. And in 2004, actually, there was a member of Congress, I think it was Maxine Waters, who challenged Ohio's electoral votes because some Democrats had a conspiracy theory about that the Republicans had stolen Ohio. And Congress did very briefly debate whether to accept Ohio's electoral votes for George W. Bush, and then they voted unanimously to do that, right? So, anyhow, I mean, these things can play out in the political branches, but we tend to want the judges to solve all of our problems.
Well, and that's a whole other topic, the degree to which we turn to the judicial branch to settle everything. But in your Florida example, if the Supreme Court had simply said, nope, we're not going to hear this, it's not any of our business, that would have had the effect of forcing it back on the Florida legislature, right?
Yeah, well, I think the concern was that the Florida Supreme Court would have, the Florida Supreme Court was apparently willing to usurp the power if they could. And so then I think that kind of goaded the Supreme Court, instead of saying it was a political question, to take up the issue. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, if the courts had all said, hey, there's a political question, the Constitution is clear, it could have been dealt with in what I would say is kind of a more constitutional manner.
Yeah. So James says, when he has discussed this issue with people that he knows, their support of the NPV is based on their ignorance. And I'm going to interpret, when he says based on their ignorance, I'm going to interpret that as just this general idea that the majority always ought to have their way, right? But James asks, do you have a reference source that I can share with these people? So have you guys published or produced any kind of little simple sort of guide or explainer or anything like that people can use as a resource?
Yeah, so two things. At saveourstates.com, we have a resource library. So if you go to saveourstates.com, you click on resources, there's a list of books and testimony and articles. There's also a list of handouts, basically one or two page PDFs that address specific issues. And if people want something a little bit more, Encounter Books has their Broadside series, which are like 40-page long, short little books that you can get on Amazon. And I wrote one for them earlier this year called Why We Must Defend the Electoral College. And it goes through the history and ends by talking. I mean, it's basically the presentation I made over the last hour with a little bit more explanation and citation. And I do think that it turned out to be something that's pretty helpful in walking through all the history. So that's Why We Must Defend the Electoral College.
Okay, and I'll just say to anybody who's on the Zoom that if you'd like a copy of that, just let us know, and we'll try to make sure you can get it. That encounter series, those encounter briefs, it's just about the right length to cover an issue,
Yeah.
without wearing you out. Um, we have another. I'm going to ask one more question from our audience, and then I'm going to ask you a closing question. I'm confused. How are individual electors actually chosen? So how does someone end up becoming an elector, even though it's maybe a pro forma kind of a job?
Yeah, that's a great question. So electors, the process starts at state political party conventions. So, and this year was a little weird, but every state in some form, the Republicans held a state convention, the Democrats held a state convention. And one of the things that they do is they elect people to be their party's presidential elector nominees. So Texas Republicans had a slate of presidential elector nominees. Texas Democrats, I don't know if Texas Libertarians were on the ballot there or Green or whatever. They all have a slate of nominees, and they send this to the Secretary of State or whoever your top election official is in your state, and they say these are our candidates for presidential elector. And when the election happens, when it's certified, right? When Texas certifies the result and says there were more votes cast for Donald Trump, for the Republican ticket than for any other candidate for president, what that means under Texas state law is that the Republican slate of electors is elected. They become Texas's presidential electors. So it starts with the political parties nominating people, and they are state elected officials. They get a certificate of election, just like somebody running for state attorney general or railroad commissioner or something. They're actually, an elected official. On December 14th, and federal law says that the states need to be done with this by December 8th. On December 14th, in every state, those presidential electors will meet. They'll cast votes for president, cast votes for vice president. They get sealed up in an envelope. Actually, it gets sealed up in a whole bunch of different envelopes. A copy of them goes to Congress. A copy of them goes to the archives, a few other places that they get sent to. And that's how that process works.
Very good. Thank you. My final question to you is, over your left shoulder, you've got a movie poster for your documentary. And it strikes me that that would be a great place for people to go to if they want to learn more or drill down a little further on this. Where can people see that documentary?
Thank you, Tom. You're my new best friend, because I'm not a good pitch man, am I? I should have mentioned that before, but we produced this documentary. It came out in September. It's on Amazon. That's the place to go and watch it, on Amazon Video. If you got Amazon Prime, it's free, and it's just a couple bucks otherwise, or you can get a DVD there also. It's called Safeguard: An Electoral College Story. And this film is designed to reach, it's designed to educate anybody, but it's really calibrated to reach younger people, your political independence. It really kind of bores in on this question of minority rights and civil rights and how the Electoral College protects these things, because as we've been talking about, and Tom, you and I clearly have similar interests in all this. I really see the Electoral College issue, it's independently important, right? And I fight to defend it every day. But I also think that engaging around the Electoral College is a great way to educate Americans about why we are not just a simple majoritarian democracy, right? It's a great way to talk about these second order effects that we get out of a system of federalism and checks and balances. And so the film, if you go and watch it, you'll get a lot more than you might expect about federalism, about checks and balances, about human nature and Federalist 10, and it's all woven in there. Frankly, with lots of images of Barack Obama and various people across the political spectrum talking about why this is so important for our republic and for protecting individual rights, minority rights, civil rights. So yeah, Safeguard: An Electoral College Story. I hope folks will watch it on Amazon. I hope folks will give it good reviews, because there are some haters on the left who have been, slandering it on Amazon reviews, and that really matters. So
You can always count on the haters to show up. What you need is for the supporters to show up, right?
Haters gonna hate.
Well, I'll tell you what, Trent, when the world returns to normal and we're allowed to do things again, we'll do a showing of your documentary in Dallas, and we'll have a grand time.
That would be terrific, Tom. I'd love to come down to Dallas and do that.
Let's just plan on that. Well, let me thank Trent England again for joining us. I encourage all of you in our audience to check him out and his organization. I want to thank Dr. Merrill Matthews for helping us out today and being part of our program. I want to thank Addie Crimmins at IPI, our Director of Events, for helping to put all this together. This video will be archived on our website and our YouTube channel. So if you thought this was just as good as I think it was, and you want to share it with your friends, you'll be able to do that. And let me again thank all of our donors and supporters who make it possible for us to do this work. We really appreciate you very much. And we would love to have some of you in our audience join us as donors and supporters. And like I suggested, contact Addie Crimmins, addie@ipi.org. And nothing would make her happier than to make that happen. So let me wrap things up with that. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Trent. That was a terrific bit of civics. And we hope you all have a good rest of your day. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.